I was just fixing a garden gate. That's all it was supposed to be. Wednesday morning started exactly like every other Wednesday for the past 8 months. My alarm went off at 6:45. I hit snooze exactly once, and by 7:30 I was stumbling around my cramped apartment kitchen, trying to make coffee with equipment that had seen better decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The toast came out slightly burned on one side, a daily tradition at this point. I scraped off the worst of it and called it breakfast. My phone was already buzzing with the usual suspects. 2 missed calls from my brother Gunter about some investment opportunity involving cryptocurrency and goats. I didn't ask for details. Voicemail from my landlord, Mrs. Miranda, reminding me that rent was due Friday, as if I could forget. And 3 texts from my neighbor Alicia Summers about her garbage disposal, which had apparently decided to stage a rebellion and was now making sounds she described as dying whale mixed with construction equipment. Then came the work call that changed everything. Is this Judd Patterson? The voice was warm but tired, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. I got your number from Henderson's Hardware. I need someone to look at a garden gate that's basically holding itself together through sheer willpower at this point. The woman introduced herself as Gemma Hotch, recently moved to Willowbrook from somewhere back east. She explained the situation. With the kind of detailed frustration that comes from staring at a problem for weeks without knowing how to fix it, the previous owners must have installed this gate during the Carter administration, she said with a slight laugh. It's wrought iron, probably beautiful once upon a time, but now it looks like it's planning its own funeral. I'm honestly afraid to touch it in case the whole thing just gives up completely. I quoted her a reasonable price for an assessment, impossible repair, packed my truck with the usual collection of tools that had gotten me, through everything from leaky faucets to collapsed deck railings, and grabbed a breakfast sandwich from Murphy's Deli that I'd probably regret by lunchtime. The drive to Willowbrook took about 25 minutes through our small corner of nowhere, past the elementary school where kids were already gathering for the morning bell, past the post office where Mr. Gilmore was probably sorting mail with the same methodical precision he'd used for the past 30 years, past the community center that hosted everything from bingo nights to heated town council meetings about parking regulations. Willowbrook was the newer part of town. It's developed in the 80s when everyone thought suburban sprawl was the answer to everything. The houses were bigger than what I was used to working on, with actual lawns, instead of the postage stamp yards closer to downtown. When I pulled into the driveway of 847 Maple Ridge Drive, I could immediately see why Gemma had called. The house itself was impressive. A 2-story colonial with good bones and mature landscaping that suggested someone had put real thought into. The design, the garden gate, looked like it was being held upright purely by habit and stubbornness. The wrought iron was beautiful, with intricate scrollwork that spoke to quality craftsmanship. But one hinge had pulled completely away from the post. Another was hanging by what appeared to be a single screw, and the latch mechanism looked like it hadn't functioned properly since the Reagan administration. That's when I saw her. Gemma Hotch was on her hands and knees in what had probably once been a flower bed, engaged in what looked like hand-to-hand combat with a collection of weeds that had clearly taken over during the transition between owners. She was wearing faded jeans with actual dirt stains, a flannel shirt that had seen better years, and work gloves that suggested she wasn't afraid of getting her hands dirty. She was somewhere in her early 50s, with shoulder-length auburn hair, streaked with silver that she'd pulled back in a practical ponytail. When she looked up at the sound of my truck door closing, I was struck by her face. Laugh lines around hazel eyes. It's a kind of expression that suggested she found life interesting, even when it was trying to bury her in unwanted vegetation. "You must be Judd," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees with the practiced motion of someone who'd been doing this for hours. "Welcome to my ongoing battle with nature." "Nature's winning." I laughed despite myself. "Looks like you're holding your own. I'm here about the gate situation." Her handshake was firm, confident, the grip of someone who'd learned not to apologize for taking up space. As she led me toward the problematic gate, I found myself noticing details. The way she moved with purpose despite the obvious fatigue, The small garden tools scattered around like she'd been working since dawn. The fact that everything about her setup suggested someone who was determined to make this place work, even if she was figuring it out as she went along, I probably should have called someone weeks ago, she admitted, gesturing at the gate that was now leaning at an angle that seemed to defy basic physics. But I kept thinking I could figure it out myself. YouTube University, you know? I examined the gate more closely. The ironwork was actually in decent condition, good quality that had been built to last. But the mounting hardware had given up completely, and someone had attempted a repair at some point using what appeared to be duct tape and hope. It's definitely salvageable, I told her, which seemed to come as a genuine relief. The metalwork is solid. We're mainly looking at new hinges, proper mounting, and probably rebuilding the latch mechanism from scratch. Thank God, Gemma said. And something in her voice suggested this gate meant more to her than just functional yard hardware. I know it's silly, but this gate was one of the things that made me fall in love with this house. It has character, you know? History. I understood. That feeling. In my line of work, you learn to recognize when something was worth saving versus when it was time to start over. This gate definitely fell into the worth-saving category. How long have you been in Willowbrook? I asked, starting to unload. My tools for a proper assessment. About 3 months, she said, and there was something carefully neutral in her tone that suggested there was more to that story. I'm still figuring out how everything works around here. The neighbors, the local, customs, which grocery store actually has decent produce. As I set up my equipment, I found myself curious about Gemma Hotch and her story. 3 months wasn't long enough to settle in completely, but it was long enough to start establishing routines. Yet something about her demeanor suggested she was still very much in transition, still figuring out not just how Willowbrook worked, but how her life was going to work in Willowbrook. The gate assessment was going to take most of the morning, and something told me I was about to learn a lot more about both the gate and the woman who was so determined to save it. Mind if I keep you company while you work? Gemma asked, returning from the house with 2 glasses of what looked like fresh lemonade, complete with actual lemon slices floating on top. I've been alone with my thoughts and these weeds for about 6 hours straight. I'm starting to have conversations with the dandelions. Sure thing, I said, already appreciating her directness. Fair warning, though, there's going to be some metal grinding, probably some creative language when these bolts don't cooperate, and definitely some trial and error. Sounds like my morning so far, she replied with a grin that reached her eyes. As I began the careful process of dismantling the gate hardware without destroying the original ironwork, Gemma settled onto her front porch steps with her lemonade and started talking. Not in the nervous way some clients do when they feel obligated to fill silence, but in the easy way of someone who genuinely enjoys conversation and has been missing it. She told me about her move from Boston, where she'd spent the last 15 years working in marketing for a mid-sized tech company, about how she'd grown tired of selling people things they didn't need and convincing them they wanted things they couldn't afford, about waking up one morning and realizing she'd been living someone else's idea of success for so long she'd forgotten what her own version looked like. I had this corner office with a view of the harbor, she said, watching me work on extracting a particularly stubborn hinge pin. Sounds impressive, right? But I realized I spent more time looking at spreadsheets than I ever did looking at that view. What's the point of having something beautiful if you never actually see it? I told her about my own complicated relationship with work, how I'd started out thinking I'd be an engineer. Spent 4 years and way too much money on a degree that led to a cubicle job designing components for industrial equipment, about how I'd lasted exactly 18 months before the fluorescent lights and endless meetings drove me to quit and start fixing things with my hands instead. My family thought I'd lost my mind, I admitted, wrestling with a bolt that had apparently been welded in place by time and weather. College-educated guy throwing it all away to become a handyman. My mom still introduces me as my son Judd. He's between careers. Gemma laughed, a real laugh, not polite social noise. Are you? Between careers? I don't think so. This feels more like what I'm supposed to be doing than anything else I've tried. Even when it's frustrating as hell. I get that, she said thoughtfully. Sometimes the thing that makes sense to everyone else is exactly what's wrong for you. As the morning progressed, our conversation drifted through safer territory. She asked about the best places to shop locally. I recommended Hendrick's Market for produce and warned her away from the gas station coffee. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She mentioned wanting to start a vegetable garden but having no idea what would actually grow in this soil. I shared my grandmother's advice about testing pH levels, starting small with herbs before attempting anything ambitious. But underneath the comfortable small talk, I was starting to piece together a larger picture. The way Gemma paused slightly. When talking about Boston, the careful way she referred to her previous situation, the fact that she was doing all this house settling entirely alone, no mentions of a partner, no we statements about future plans, no evidence that anyone else had been involved in this major life transition. Around 10:30, she disappeared into the house and returned with coffee and a plate of what she called experimental muffins. Let me guess, I said, accepting a cup that smelled like it had come from actual coffee beans rather than a machine. The oven's still teaching you its personality. Worse, I'm teaching myself to bake from scratch because apparently buying muffins felt like giving up, she said, settling back onto the porch steps. These might be terrible, but they're terrible with intention. They weren't terrible. They were actually pretty good. Blueberry with a hint of something unexpected, maybe cardamom. I told her so, and her face lit up with a kind of pleased surprise that suggested she wasn't used to succeeding at domestic experiments. You know, she said, watching me work on freeing the gate from its hinges so I could properly assess the damage. This is the first real conversation I've had since I moved here. The neighbors are friendly enough, but it's all been very surface level. Weather and trash pickup schedules. Small towns take a while to warm up, I said. People around here are nice, but they're also cautious about newcomers. Give it time. How much time? She asked, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. Depends. Some people break in faster than others. Usually helps if you have a reason to stick around, something that roots you to the community. Gemma was quiet for a moment, considering this. What if you're not sure you have a reason yet? That stopped me mid-wrench turn. I looked at her more carefully, trying to read the expression on her face. You thinking about leaving already? No, she said quickly, then paused. Maybe, I don't know. This whole move was pretty impulsive. Sometimes I wonder if I just ran away from problems instead of solving them. What kind of problems? Another? Pause. Longer this time. Gemma stood and walked over to examine my progress on the gate, running her fingers along the intricate ironwork that someone had crafted with obvious care decades ago. The kind that follow you, whether you stay or go, she said finally. Kind that make you question everything you thought you knew about your own life. Before I could ask what she meant, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and I watched her. Entire demeanor shift, shoulders tensing, easy smile fading into something more guarded. Excuse me for a minute, she said, walking toward the backyard with the phone pressed to her ear. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could hear the tone clipped, formal, nothing like the warm conversational voice I'd been listening to all morning. When she returned 5 minutes later, she looked like she'd aged a year in the span of a single phone call. Everything okay? I asked. Just some unfinished business from Boston, she said, but the lightness in her voice sounded forced now. Nothing that can't wait, as I went back to work on the gate. I found myself wondering what kind of unfinished business could reach across 3 states and knock the easy confidence out of someone like Gemma Hotch, and why she'd moved all the way to Willowbrook to escape it. The next day, I returned with replacement hardware and a plan for properly restoring the gate. Gemma was already outside when I arrived, this time attempting to wrangle what appeared to be an overgrown hedge that had declared independence from any reasonable shape or size. The previous owners apparently believed in letting nature take its course, she called out, wrestling with a branch that seemed determined to poke her in the eye. I'm starting to think they just gave up on yard maintenance entirely and hoped for the best. How's that working out for you? I asked, unloading my tools. About as well as you'd expect, she said, stepping back to survey her progress. The hedge looked like it had been attacked by someone with good intentions, but questionable technique. May have bitten off more than I can chew with this whole maintaining a yard thing. I began the process of properly removing the gate so I could work on it in my shop. Gemma abandoned her hedge battle and settled into what was becoming our morning routine. Coffee appeared. Real coffee. The kind that suggested she'd invested in decent equipment since moving here. She brought out 2 mugs and claimed her spot on the porch steps, ready to provide commentary and company while I worked. "Can I ask you something?" she said after we'd fallen into comfortable conversation about the gate restoration process. "Do you ever feel like you're starting over at completely the wrong time in your life?" The question caught me off guard, partly because of how personal it was, but mostly because of the way she asked it, like the answer actually mattered to her on some deeper level. "What do you mean?" Here I am at 53, trying to figure out how to live alone for the first time in my adult life. Learning to bake muffins and trim hedges and fix things I've never had to think about before. She gestured around at her yard, her house, the whole project of reinventing herself. Shouldn't I have figured this stuff out decades ago? I stopped working and looked at her directly. Who says there's a timeline for figuring things out? Society. Family. The little voice in my head that keeps asking why I couldn't have had this crisis at 30 instead of 50. She took a sip of her coffee, looking out at the yard that was clearly going to be a long-term project. "Sometimes I feel like I'm 20 years behind where I should be." "Or maybe," I said carefully, "you're exactly where you need to be now." That earned me a small smile. "That's either very wise or very kind. Can it be both?" as the morning progressed. Gemma began sharing more details about her previous life in Boston, about the marketing agency, where she'd spent 15 years climbing a ladder she'd never really wanted to climb, about the corporate apartment with harbor view she never had. Time to enjoy. About colleagues who measured success in billable hours and corner office square footage. "I was good at it," she said, handing me tools as I worked on removing stubborn bolts. "Really good. I could sell anything to anyone, create campaigns that made people feel like they needed things they'd never heard of 5 minutes earlier. But you didn't enjoy it?" "I enjoyed parts of it. The creativity, the problem solving, the satisfaction of a campaign that really worked." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But I started feeling like I was using my powers for evil, convincing people to buy things they couldn't afford to solve problems they didn't really have. I understood that feeling. Stint in corporate engineering had left me with similar questions about whether the work I was doing actually made the world better or just more complicated. What changed?" I asked, "What made you finally decide to leave?" Mama was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee mug in her hands like it might provide answers. "I turned 53 last spring," she said finally, "and I realized I'd been living for someday for as long as I could remember. Someday when I had enough saved up, someday when the market was better, someday when I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life." She stood and walked over to examine my progress on the gate hardware. "But someday never actually comes, does it? It just keeps moving further into the future while you use up all your todays waiting for it."
Ow.
"So you decided to stop waiting?" "I decided to stop letting fear make my decisions for me," she said, and there was something fierce in her voice now, even if it meant making some very expensive mistakes. Before I could ask what she meant by expensive mistakes, her phone rang. Again, I watched the same transformation as yesterday, the easy openness replaced by careful guardedness. "I need to take this," she said, walking toward the backyard with the phone already pressed to her ear. This time I could hear fragments of the conversation, though I tried not to listen. Her voice was clipped, professional, nothing like the warm, conversational tone I'd been enjoying. "No, that's not what we agreed to," I heard her say. "The timeline was clear. I don't care what his lawyer says. That money was part of the settlement." When she returned 10 minutes later, she looked exhausted. "Sorry about that," she said, settling back onto the porch steps. "Legal stuff, very boring." "Doesn't sound boring," I said gently. "Sounds stressful." Was quiet for a moment, staring out at her work-in-progress yard. "Do you know what the hardest part about starting over is?" "What's that?" "The part where your old life keeps trying to drag you back into it," she said. "Even when you've moved 3 states away and changed everything about how you live." I wanted to ask for details. to understand what kind of legal situation was causing her so much obvious stress. Something in her posture told me she'd shared as much as she was comfortable sharing for now. "For what it's worth," I said, going back to work on the gate, "from an outside perspective, you seem to be handling the starting over part pretty well." "How can you tell?" "Well, you're not hiding in your house waiting for someone else to fix your problems. You're out here getting dirt under your fingernails and learning to trim hedges badly and asking good questions about what comes next. That earned me another real smile, even if I'm doing it all 20 years too late, especially because you're doing it now instead of waiting another 20 years. As I loaded the gate components into my truck to take back to my shop for proper restoration, I found myself thinking about Gemma's question. Was there really a right time to start over? Or was the right time simply whenever you finally got brave enough to try? Looking at her standing in her chaotic yard, surrounded by projects, she was determined to figure out one way or another. I was pretty sure bravery didn't have an expiration date. I spent the next 2 days in my shop, carefully restoring each piece of Gemma's gate. The ironwork was even more beautiful than I'd initially realized. Someone had put real artistry into the scrollwork and decorative elements. As I cleaned decades of paint and rust from the metal, I found myself thinking about what Gemma had said about things being worth saving, about character and history. When I returned to reinstall the gate, I found Gemma in her backyard, sitting at a patio table covered with papers and looking like she'd been there for hours. Her laptop was open, her phone was nearby, and she had that particular expression people get when they're trying to solve a puzzle with too many missing pieces. "Paperwork day?" I asked, wheeling the restored gate around to the front yard. "Something like that," she said, but her smile seemed forced. "How did the restoration go? See for yourself." I spent the next hour carefully reinstalling the gate, making sure everything was properly aligned and functional. When I finally stepped back to let Gemma see the finished product, her reaction was everything I'd hoped for. "Oh my God," she said, running her hands along the restored ironwork. "It's beautiful. It looks like it did in the old photos the realtor showed me." She opened and closed the gate several times, testing the smooth operation, admiring the way it swung true and latched securely. "Thank you, Judd. This is ... This is perfect. Should last another 50 years easy," I said, genuinely pleased with how the restoration had turned out. The metalwork was solid, it just needed proper hardware and some attention. "Kind of like everything else around here," Gemma said. But there was something wistful in her voice as I packed up my tools. I noticed she seemed reluctant to go back inside, reluctant to return to whatever paperwork had been occupying her morning. "Everything okay?" I asked. "You seem a little stressed today." Gemma was quiet for a moment, looking at her newly restored gate like it represented something larger than just functional yard hardware. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Something personal?" "Sure. Have you ever been married?" The question caught me off guard. "No. Came close once, but it didn't work out. Why?" "I was married for 26 years, she said, settling. Onto her porch steps, in what had become our usual conversation spot, to someone I thought I knew completely. It turns out I didn't know him at all. Sat down beside her, sensing this was the conversation we'd been building toward for days. "That's part of why I moved here," she continued. "Part of the Starting Over project. The divorce was finalized 6 months ago, and I thought I could just leave all that behind and build something new. But it followed you in ways I didn't expect." Gemma gestured toward the papers scattered on her backyard table. "Those phone calls I've been getting? My ex-husband's lawyer. Apparently, there are some complications with our settlement agreement." I waited, giving her space to share as much or as little as she wanted. "The short version is that Lionel, my ex, wasn't entirely honest about our financial situation during the divorce proceedings," she said, and there was a bitter edge to her voice now. "Some assets that weren't disclosed, some debts that were conveniently forgotten, some business dealings that apparently happened without my knowledge. That sounds like grounds for reopening the settlement. That's what my lawyer says. But it also means going back to court, fighting the same battles all over again, and probably spending months dealing with a man I was hoping never to see again." Gemma stood and started pacing across her front porch. The same restless energy I'd noticed whenever she talked about her previous life. "The worst part isn't even the money," she said. "It's the realization that 26 years of marriage was built on lies I never saw coming. While I was planning our retirement and thinking about what we'd do with our golden years, he was apparently planning his exit strategy and hiding assets." "How did you find out?" "His new girlfriend," Gemma said with a laugh that had no humor. "In it, 28 years old, works at his gym, apparently has more integrity than my ex-husband ever did. She found some paperwork that didn't make sense and started asking questions. I tried to process that. His girlfriend turned him in. His girlfriend realized she'd been lied to just as much as I had been," Gemma corrected. "Turns out Lionel told her he was divorced when they started their affair. When she found out he was still married, she started digging into his story and discovered the financial deception." "So she's helping you fight this? She's willing to testify?" "Yes. But it means dragging everything back into the light, dealing with lawyers and depositions and all the ugliness I moved here to escape." Gemma stopped pacing and leaned against her porch railing, looking out at the yard she'd been working so hard to transform. "You know what the hardest part is?" she said quietly. "It's not even the betrayal, though. That was devastating. It's the self-doubt. 26 years, and I never suspected anything. What does that say about my judgment? How do I trust myself to make good decisions about anything if I could be that blind to what was happening in my own marriage?" "It says you trusted someone you should have been able to trust," I said firmly. "That's not a character flaw, Gemma. That's what marriage is supposed to be." "Is it, though? Or was I just naive?" "There's a difference between being naive and being deliberately deceived. What Lionel did wasn't your fault." She looked at me then, really looked like she was trying to decide whether to believe that. "My lawyer wants me to come back to Boston next week for depositions," she said. "And I keep thinking, what if I just don't? What if I just let him keep whatever he stole and focus on building something new here instead? Would you be able to live with that? I don't know. But I also don't know if I have the strength to fight this battle again. I already lost 26 years of my life to his lies. How much more do I want to give him?" As I loaded my tools into the truck, I found myself thinking about what Gemma had shared. The courage it had taken to leave a marriage that had defined half her adult life. The strength it was taking to rebuild herself from scratch at 53. And now the impossible choice between seeking justice and protecting the peace she'd worked so hard to find. "For what it's worth," I said as I prepared to leave, "whatever you decide about Boston, you've got more strength than you realize. Anyone who can restore a life can handle whatever comes next. Even if I'm making it up as I go along, especially then," I said. "The best decisions usually get made by people who are brave enough to figure it out as they go." I didn't plan to come back the next day. The gate was finished, perfectly functional, and my work was technically done. But something about the way Gemma had looked when I left, lost. Overwhelmed, facing an impossible choice between her past and her future, kept nagging at me through the evening, so I found myself driving back to Willowbrook Friday morning with a thermos of coffee and a flimsy excuse about checking the gate's alignment after it. It settled overnight. Gemma was already outside when I arrived, but she wasn't working in the garden this time. She was sitting on her front porch swing still, in what looked like yesterday's clothes, surrounded by legal documents and holding a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold hours ago. "You're up early," I called, getting out of my truck. "Never went to bed," she admitted, looking up with tired eyes. "I've been trying to make sense of all this paperwork, figure out what I actually stand to gain versus what I'll have to go through to get it." I walked over and settled beside her on the swing, careful not to disturb the papers scattered around her. "Any conclusions?" "Several. Most of them contradictory." She gestured at the documents with the kind of exhausted frustration that comes from staring at the same problem for too long. "On paper, it looks like I could recover a significant amount of money, maybe enough to pay off this house completely and have a real cushion for the future. That sounds like a good thing." "It does, doesn't it? But it also means months of legal proceedings. Depositions where I'll have to relive every detail of my marriage's collapse. I'm probably facing Lionel in court while he tries to paint me as vindictive and grasping." Set down her coffee cup and leaned back against the swing, looking more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. And there's another complication I haven't mentioned, she said quietly. The girlfriend who's willing to testify, Evelyn Miranda, wants to meet with me first, face to face. Before she agrees to cooperate with my legal team. That makes sense, I guess. She probably wants to make sure you're not going to crucify her as part of this. Maybe she wants to salve her conscience by helping the wife she helped. Betray, even if she didn't know that's what she was doing at the time. I could hear the conflict in Gemma's voice, anger at the situation, gratitude for unexpected help, and something deeper that sounded like fear. What are you afraid of? I asked gently. That she look at me and understand why Lionel left. Gemma said, so quietly I almost missed it, that she see a 53-year-old woman who let herself go, got comfortable and boring and predictable, and she realized she was the obvious upgrade. The pain in her voice hit me like a physical blow. I turned to face her directly. Gemma, that's not, isn't it, though? She interrupted, and now there were tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. 28 years old, works at a gym, probably has the kind of energy and enthusiasm I had when I was her age. I wouldn't choose that over a middle-aged wife who was more interested in retirement planning than spontaneous adventures. I wanted to argue with her, to list all the reasons her ex-husband's choices had nothing to do with her worth and everything to do with his character. But something about the way she was looking at me stopped me from launching into reassurances. She probably wouldn't believe anyway. Instead, I found myself thinking about everything I'd learned about Gemma over the past week. Her determination to restore an old gate instead of taking the easy route. Her willingness to completely upend her life when it stopped fitting. Her kindness to a neighbor's cat that had been visiting her garden, even though she wasn't particularly fond of cats. The way she made real lemonade and experimental muffins and asked thoughtful questions about everything from soil composition to life philosophy. Can I ask you something? I said, echoing her words from our earlier conversations. Sure. I took a breath, knowing I was about to step way outside the boundaries of handyman and client, but unable to stop myself. Would you marry me, even if? I'm 53. I'm not kidding. Gemma's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. What? Not me specifically, I said quickly, my heart racing at my own audacity. Not necessarily, but would you? Would a man my age or any age consider himself lucky to find a woman like you, regardless of what year you were born? For a long moment, she just stared at me, like she was trying to determine if I was serious. I mean it, Gemma, I continued, committed now to saying what I'd been thinking for days. You're 53 years old, and you just completely rebuilt your life, because you had the courage to admit it wasn't working. You moved across the country to a place where you didn't know anyone, bought a house with a broken gate and overgrown gardens, and you're figuring it out one day at a time. I gestured around at her property, at the evidence of all the work she'd been doing to make this place her own. You're learning to bake and trim hedges, and probably a dozen other things you never had to think about before you're dealing with. Legal battles and financial complications and starting over from scratch. And you're doing it all with more grace than most people half your age would manage. Gemma was quiet, but she was listening intently. So yes, I said firmly. Times yes. Any man who couldn't see that you're exactly the right age to know who you are and what you want, who couldn't recognize that confidence and determination and kindness when he saw it, would be the one with the problem, not you. She blinked hard, and a tear escaped down her cheek. You really mean that? I really mean that, I said. Your ex-husband didn't leave because you weren't good enough. He left because he wasn't brave enough to grow up alongside someone who was becoming more herself every year. Gemma wiped her eyes and looked at me with something that might have been wonder. That's either the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me, she said softly, or you're a much better person than I deserve to have wandering into my life. Maybe? Both, I said, trying to lighten the moment while meaning every word. But probably you deserve better than you think. For the first time since I'd arrived that morning, Gemma smiled. Not the careful, polite smile she used with strangers, but something real and grateful, and maybe even hopeful. Thank you, she said. For the gate, for the question, for making me remember that starting over doesn't have to mean settling for less. As we sat there on our porch swing, surrounded by legal papers and impossible decisions, Something had fundamentally shifted between us. The question had been asked and answered, but more than that. A possibility had been acknowledged that neither of us had seen coming when this all started with a broken gate. A woman who believed in saving things that were worth saving. The weekend passed in a strange kind of suspended animation. I found reasons to check on Gemma, a loose board on her back deck that needed attention, a dripping outdoor faucet that was probably just a washer issue, a garden trellis that could use reinforcement before the climbing roses got too heavy. Small projects that we both knew weren't urgent, but that gave us excuses to spend time together while we figured out what had changed between us. Gemma seemed lighter somehow. Like asking the question and hearing my answer had lifted some weight she'd been carrying. She laughed more easily, made jokes about her ongoing battle with the hedge, and started planning improvements to her garden with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she was really settling in for the long haul. But underneath the easier dynamic was also a new kind of tension. Not uncomfortable exactly, but charged with awareness. When she handed me tools, our fingers would brush and we'd both notice. When I caught her watching me work, she wouldn't immediately look away like she had before. Small moments that probably meant nothing or everything, depending on how you interpreted them. Sunday evening, I was helping her move some heavy planters when her phone rang. Again, we both froze when we saw the caller ID, Evelyn Miranda. "I should probably take this," Gemma said, but she looked at the phone like it might bite her. "Want me to stick around?" I asked. She nodded gratefully and answered the call, putting it on speaker without thinking about it. "Ms. Hotch?" "This is Evelyn. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." The voice was younger than I had expected, but there was something steady about it that surprised me. Not the flighty 20-year-old I'd been imagining, but someone who sounded genuinely serious about the situation. "I appreciate you reaching out," Gemma said carefully, "though I have to admit I'm not entirely sure what to expect from this conversation." "I understand that," Evelyn said. "I know this is an impossible situation for both of us, but I think we need to talk before any lawyers get involved, because there are things about Lionel that you need to know. Things that might change how you want to handle this whole mess." Gemma's grip tightened on the phone. "What kind of things?" "The kind that suggests this pattern goes back a lot further than either of us realized," Evelyn said quietly. "I've been doing some research since I found those financial documents, and I think you and I weren't the only women Lionel lied to. The silence that followed was heavy with implications." "What do you mean?" Gemma asked. I think there were others, other relationships, other deceptions, possibly other financial improprieties that go back years. Maybe the entire time you were married." I watched the color drain from Gemma's face as she processed this information. "How many others?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet, but I found credit card statements with charges. At hotels and restaurants in cities where Lionel supposedly traveled for business, patterns of behavior that suggest this wasn't just about him having a midlife crisis and falling for someone younger." Evelyn paused, and when she continued, her voice was gentler. "Ms. Hotch, I think your husband was a serial cheater who got very good at covering his tracks. I think when he decided to leave you for me, he saw it as an opportunity to clean out as much of your shared assets as possible before you could figure out what was happening." Gemma sank down onto her porch steps, looking like she'd been physically struck. 26 years, she said, almost to herself. 26 years of thinking I was in a marriage while I was actually just ... What? The convenient cover story? "I'm so sorry," Evelyn said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I know this is devastating to hear. But I also think it means you have a much stronger case than your lawyers initially realized. This isn't just about hidden assets from your divorce. This is about fraud that potentially spans decades." "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we work together to expose everything," Evelyn said firmly. "Not just the recent financial deception, but the whole pattern. And I'm suggesting that, when we're done, Lionel faces consequences for more than just cheating on his wife. He faces consequences for systematically deceiving and defrauding multiple women over the course of years." Gemma looked at me, and I could see the war playing out in her expression. It's a part of her that wanted justice, that wanted Lionel to face the full consequences of his actions, and the part of her that just wanted to be done with him, to focus on building her new life without getting dragged back into the wreckage of her old one. This would mean a much bigger legal battle, she said slowly. More time, more money, more exposure, yes, Evelyn admitted. But it would also mean a much bigger settlement. And it would mean making sure Lionel can't do this to anyone else. Evelyn hung up with promises to send more information by email. Gemma and I sat in silence for a long time. What are you thinking? I asked finally. I'm thinking, she said slowly, that I spent 26 years believing I was married to someone who never actually existed. I'm thinking that maybe it's time to stop being the victim of his lies and start being the person who makes sure he faces the truth. She looked at me directly. But I'm also thinking that I can't do this alone.
Not just the legal battle, but all of it.
Starting over, figuring out who I am when I'm not defining myself in relation to someone else's deception. You're not alone, I said simply, even if it gets messy. Even if this drags on for months and gets ugly and complicated, especially then, I said, echoing our earlier conversation. Besides, I'm pretty good at fixing complicated things. 4. The first time since the phone call, Gemma smiled. Is that what you think I am? A complicated thing that needs fixing? No, I said honestly. I think you're someone who's been broken by someone else's choices. And now you're deciding whether to put yourself back together the same way you were, or build something completely new. Which do you think I should do? I think I said. Reaching over to take her hand, you should build something completely new. I think you should make Lionel pay for every lie he told along the way. The meeting with Evelyn was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon at a quiet cafe in downtown Willowbrook. Gemma had asked if I wanted to come along again, and this time I didn't hesitate to say yes. Whatever was developing between us had moved far beyond the boundaries of professional courtesy. And we both knew it. Evelyn Miranda turned out to be nothing like either of us had expected. Instead of the gym-obsessed 20-year-old I'd imagined, she was a petite woman with serious dark eyes, wearing a business suit that suggested she had a real job that had nothing to do with Lionel's fitness routine. She carried herself with the kind of careful composure that people develop when they've been forced to grow up fast. Thank you both for meeting with me, she said, settling into the booth across from us with a laptop bag that looked like it weighed. As much as she did, I know this situation is beyond awkward for everyone involved. That's one way to put it, Gemma replied. But her tone was more curious than hostile. Evelyn opened her laptop and pulled up what appeared to be a detailed spreadsheet. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. I'm not just Lionel's ex-girlfriend trying to make amends. I'm a forensic accountant for a financial consulting firm in Boston. When I started finding discrepancies in Lionel's personal finances, I approached it the same way I would any suspected fraud case. Gemma and I exchanged glances. This was not the conversation either of us had been expecting. What did you find? Gemma asked. Evidence of systematic financial manipulation. Going back at least 15 years, Evelyn said, turning her laptop screen toward us. Hidden accounts, shell companies, property transfers, designed to obscure ownership. And what appears to be a pattern of using romantic relationships to facilitate financial fraud. The spreadsheet was color-coded and meticulously organized, showing patterns of behavior that painted a picture of someone who had turned deception into an art form. How many women? Gemma asked quietly. That I can document? 7, including you and me. But I suspect there were more. Evelyn clicked through several tabs of data. The pattern is always the same. Lionel would establish a relationship, gain access to financial information or joint accounts, gradually move assets around in ways that would benefit him if the relationship ended, and then disappear when the woman started asking questions. 7 women, Gemma repeated, like she was, trying to process the scope of what she was hearing. But here's the thing that makes your case different, Evelyn continued. You were married to him. Which means what he did to you wasn't just relationship fraud, it was spousal financial abuse on a massive scale. And because you were legally entitled to half of everything he earned during your marriage, every dollar he hid represents not just theft, but a violation of a court-enforceable legal agreement. I watched Gemma absorb this information, seeing the anger start to build behind her eyes. You said you could document this? She asked. I can do better than that, Evelyn said, pulling a thick folder from her bag. I can provide evidence that will not only support your civil case, but probably interest the district attorney's office as well. What Lionel did crosses the line from marital misconduct into criminal fraud. Criminal charges? Wire fraud, tax evasion, possibly RICO violations, if we can prove the pattern was systematic enough. Evelyn's voice was getting stronger, more confident. This isn't just about getting you the money you're owed, Gemma. This is about making. Sure, Lionel faces serious consequences for what he's done to multiple women over the course of decades. Gemma was quiet for a long moment, staring at the spreadsheet full of evidence that her entire adult life had been built on lies. Why? She asked finally. Why are you doing this? You could have just walked away when you found out he was married. You didn't have to dig deeper. Evelyn's professional composure cracked slightly, because when I found out he'd lied to me about being divorced, I started wondering what else he'd lied about. And when I found evidence that he'd been systematically stealing from his wife for years, I realized I'd been an unwitting accessory to something horrible. She paused, choosing her words carefully. But also because I spent 6 months falling, in love with someone who never existed, and I want him to face consequences for making me complicit in destroying your marriage without my knowledge or consent. What happens now? I asked. Now we decide whether to move forward, Evelyn said, looking directly at Gemma. If we do this, it's going to be a long, ugly battle. Lionel has money and lawyers, and he's going to fight back hard. But if we can prove what I think we can prove, he's looking at serious jail time, and you're looking at a settlement that could be 10 times what you originally thought you were owed. Gemma reached for my hand under the table, and I squeezed back, offering what support I could. How long? She asked, realistically. 18 months to 2 years if it goes to trial. Maybe less if he agrees to plead guilty and cooperate with returning the stolen assets. And if I say no, if I decide I just want to walk away from all of this, then Lionel gets away with it, Evelyn said simply. He'll probably do it again. To someone else? After Evelyn left with promises to send over more detailed documentation, Gemma and I sat in the cafe for another hour. Not talking, just processing the magnitude of what we'd learned. This changes everything, she said finally. Does it? I came here to start over, to build something new and leave the past behind. But now it feels like I can't really move forward until I deal with what he did. Not just to me, but to all of us. I nodded. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Gemma said, and there was steel in her voice now, that it's time to stop running from my past and start fighting for my future. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when the story involves justice, betrayal, and a neighbor who's been quietly winning everyone over with her determination to restore a century-old garden gate. By Thursday morning, Gemma's front yard had somehow become the unofficial headquarters for what the locals were calling Operation Take Down the Bastard. It started with Alicia Summers, my neighbor who'd been having garbage disposal issues. Showed up around 9 with homemade banana bread and a folder full of printouts about victims' rights organizations. I hope you don't mind, she said to Gemma, settling onto the porch steps like she belonged there. But Judd mentioned you were dealing with some legal troubles with your ex-husband. I went through something similar about 5 years ago, not nearly as complicated as your situation, but I learned a few things about navigating the system before Gemma could respond. Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down appeared with a thermos of coffee and what appeared to be a hand-drawn organizational chart. Evelyn Patterson, she announced, shaking Gemma's hand with military precision. Retired Army Logistics Coordinator. Here you're mounting a campaign against financial fraud. I brought coffee and a preliminary operational assessment. Oh, what now? Gemma asked, looking bewildered. Strategic planning, Mrs. Patterson explained, spreading her chart on the porch table. Legal battles are like military operations. You need clear objectives. Defined timelines, resource allocation, and contingency planning. Also coffee. Lots of coffee. By noon, the impromptu strategy session had grown to include my brother Gunther, who'd driven over from his apartment with a laptop and surprising expertise in digital forensics, and a woman named Arden Hotch Hood, introduced herself as a paralegal from the county legal aid office and Gemma's second cousin. Small world, Arden had said when she arrived. When I heard the name Gemma Hotch was involved in a major fraud case, I had to check if you were family. Turns out, our great-grandfathers were brothers. I don't understand how everyone found out about this, Gemma said to me quietly while the impromptu legal team debated filing strategies around her patio table. Alicia has a big mouth. Mrs. Patterson has a background in military intelligence. And your cousin works in the legal system, I explained. Plus, everyone in Willowbrook has been rooting for you since you moved here. You're the woman who saved the historic gate and grows the best tomatoes in the neighborhood. I don't grow. Tomatoes, you will? Mrs. Patterson already has opinions about your garden layout for next spring. The strangest addition to the group was Gilmore Miranda, the postal worker who'd quietly been documenting years of suspicious mail patterns to addresses associated with Lionel's various shell companies. I probably shouldn't be sharing this information, he said, producing a manila envelope full of carefully organized records. But when someone's using the postal system to facilitate fraud, that becomes a federal matter. And federal matters are my business. Evelyn arrived around 2 o'clock with her laptop and 3 additional boxes of evidence. Looking surprised to find Gemma's front yard transformed into what looked like a cross between a legal aid clinic and a neighborhood barbecue. This is ... unexpected, she said, surveying the scene. This is Willowbrook, Gemma replied, and I could hear something like wonder in her voice. Apparently when you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. The afternoon turned into an impromptu strategy session that was part legal planning, part community organizing, and part therapy session. Mrs. Patterson assigned roles and timelines with military efficiency. Arden provided insights into local court procedures and judge preferences. Gunther set up digital security protocols to protect sensitive documents. Gilmore shared federal mail fraud statutes that could add years to Lionel's potential sentence. But the real transformation was in Gemma herself. Watching her interact with this unlikely coalition of supporters, I could see her evolving from someone who'd been isolated by her ex-husband's deceptions into someone who was surrounded by people, genuinely invested in her success. You know what the best part of this is? Alicia said as the group started to disperse around 5 o'clock. Lionel thought he could hide his crimes by targeting women who were isolated, who didn't have support systems to fight back. But he picked the wrong woman this time. How so? Evelyn asked. Because Gemma moved to a place where neighbors actually give a damn about each other? Mrs. Patterson declared, packing up her organizational charts with military precision. Not because she had the good sense to hire a handyman who's too stubborn. To let injustice slide. After everyone left, Gemma and I sat on her porch swing, surrounded by the detritus of an afternoon that had fundamentally changed the scope of her legal battle. I came here to be alone, she said quietly. To figure out who I was when I wasn't half of a couple, when I wasn't defining myself in relation to someone else's needs and expectations. And it turns out I'm someone who inspires elderly, military veterans to draw organizational charts, and postal workers to bend federal regulations, and forensic accountants to spend their weekends building criminal cases against serial fraudsters. I laughed. Is that a bad thing? It's terrifying, she admitted. But also ... amazing. I spent 26 years married to someone who made me feel like I was too much, too emotional, too invested, too demanding of honesty and communication. And now I'm surrounded by people who think I'm worth fighting for. You are worth fighting for, I said simply. Even if it takes 2 years and gets messy and complicated. Especially then, I said, pulling her closer on the swing. Besides, I'm starting to think complicated might be exactly what I've been looking for. As we sat there watching the sun set over her restored garden gate, I realized that what had started as a simple repair job had become something much more significant. Gemma wasn't just rebuilding her life, she was building a community. Somehow, I'd become part of both projects. The first real blow came 3 weeks later, just as our makeshift legal team was hitting its stride. Evelyn had been working with Arden to compile evidence for the district attorney's office. Mrs. Patterson had created what she called operational protocols for document management. And Gunther had discovered digital trails that connected Lionel. 2 financial accounts in 4 different states. Then Lionel's lawyers fired back. They're claiming harassment, Arden announced, arriving at Gemma's house on a rainy Tuesday morning with a folder full of legal documents and an expression that suggested bad news. Lionel filed a restraining order against Evelyn, claiming she's stalking him and interfering with his business operations. That's ridiculous, Gemma said, looking up from the kitchen table where she'd been reviewing bank statements with Evelyn. She's building a criminal case based on documented evidence. I know that. You know that. And the DA's office knows that, Arden replied, settling into a chair with the weary expression of someone who'd spent too many years dealing with the legal system. But Lionel's attorneys are arguing that a private citizen conducting an investigation without law enforcement oversight constitutes harassment, regardless of what she finds. Evelyn closed her laptop with more force than necessary. He's trying to shut down the investigation before we can finish building the case. Is it working? I asked, though I could tell from Arden's expression that the answer wasn't good. Partially. The restraining order means Evelyn can't contact Lionel directly or access any of his financial records without going through official channels, which slows everything down considerably. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been quietly reviewing the legal paperwork, looked up with the kind of expression that suggested someone was about to receive a tactical assessment they wouldn't enjoy. This is a delaying tactic, she announced. Defensive maneuver. He's trying to bog us down in procedural complications while he moves assets around and covers his tracks. So what do we do? Gemma asked. We adapt, Mrs. Patterson said simply. If he wants to play procedural games, we play them better. Arden, what's the timeline for challenging the restraining order? 2 weeks minimum, probably longer if his lawyers... File extensions. Too long, Mrs. Patterson declared. Gunther, how much of the digital evidence have you secured? About 60%, my brother replied, looking up from his laptop where he'd been cross-referencing financial records. But some of the accounts Evelyn identified are already showing suspicious activity. Money moving around, accounts being closed, assets being transferred. He's cleaning house, Evelyn said grimly. Everything we've worked to document, he's trying to make disappear. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Months of work, evidence that could put Lionel away for years and recover hundreds of thousands of dollars for his victims, potentially vanishing because he'd managed to slow down the investigation just long enough to cover his tracks. That's... When Gilmore Miranda spoke up from his corner of the kitchen, where he'd been quietly sorting through mail records. Not everything, he said, producing a thick manila envelope. Federal mail fraud investigation doesn't stop because of a state restraining order. And the Postal Inspection Service has been very interested in the patterns I've been documenting. Spread out a series of documents that looked official and intimidating. Warrants were issued yesterday morning for financial records, associated with 17 different addresses where Lionel has received mail over the past 5 years, bank accounts, investment portfolios, property records, all of it. The feds are moving independently? Arden asked, looking surprised. The feds have been moving for 2 weeks, Gilmore corrected, ever since I shared my documentation with the Postal Inspection Service. And mail fraud is a federal crime, and when it's systematic, across multiple states, over multiple years, it becomes a very serious federal crime. Mrs. Patterson actually smiled at this news, the kind of expression a general might wear when an unexpected tactical advantage presented itself. So while Lionel's lawyers are tying us up with state court proceedings, she said, federal investigators are building their own case using evidence he can't make disappear. Exactly, Gilmore confirmed. And because it's a federal investigation, his state court restraining order doesn't apply. Evelyn can continue working with federal authorities to provide evidence and testimony. The mood in the room shifted dramatically. What had felt like a crushing setback 5 minutes earlier now looked like a temporary inconvenience in a much larger game. Long before the federal case moves forward? Gemma asked. My contact at the Postal Inspection Service, they're planning arrests within the next month, Gilmore said. They want to move fast before he can liquidate more assets. Evelyn reopened her laptop with renewed energy. Then we need to get everything we've compiled to the federal investigators immediately. Bank records, victim testimonies, digital evidence, all of it. I can facilitate that, Arden offered. I have contacts in the federal prosecutor's office. As the impromptu strategy session continued around her kitchen table, I watched Gemma process this latest development. The relief was obvious. Her case wasn't falling apart after all. but there was something else in her expression, something that looked like amazement at the scope of what they'd all accomplished together. 6 weeks ago, I was just trying to figure out whether to fight for money that was rightfully mine, she said quietly. Now we're coordinating with federal investigators to take down a serial fraud operation. That's what happens, Mrs. Patterson said matter-of-factly. When you stop thinking like a victim and start thinking like someone who refuses to let criminals get away with crime, or, I added, catching Gemma's eye, when you move to a place where neighbors don't let neighbors fight battles alone. As rain continued to fall outside, turning Gemma's garden into something lush and green and alive, I realized we'd all become something we hadn't expected. Not just a legal team or a support network, but a community that had formed around the simple idea that justice mattered, that standing up for what was right was worth whatever complications it brought. The federal agents arrived on a Thursday morning in March, 6 months after Gemma had first asked me to fix her garden gate. I was at her house installing new window boxes, another excuse to spend time with her while we waited for the legal system to do its work when Evelyn called, with news that made Gemma sink onto her porch steps in relief. "They arrested him," Evelyn said, her voice carrying clearly through the speakerphone. FBI picked him up at his apartment this morning. Wire fraud, mail fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges. 17 counts total. Mrs. Patterson Hood developed a habit of appearing whenever important news was breaking, materialized from her house with coffee and her ever-present notebook. "What about the assets?" she asked, settling onto the porch with military efficiency. "Frozen," Evelyn confirmed. Federal marshals seized 4 bank accounts, 2 investment portfolios, and that vacation property in Nevada that Gemma never knew existed. Plus, they're going after a boat he bought last year and some kind of vintage car collection. "How much money are we talking about?" Gemma asked, though her voice suggested she was almost afraid to hear the answer. "Preliminary estimates suggest he stole close to $2 million from various victims over the past 15 years, Evelyn said. "Your portion of that, based on what should have been disclosed during the divorce, is probably around $400,000. The silence that followed was heavy with the magnitude of what that number represented. Not just money, but validation. Proof that Gemma's instincts about their finances being wrong had been accurate. Evidence that she hadn't been paranoid or demanding when she'd questioned. Discrepancies in their lifestyle versus their supposed income. 400,000, she repeated quietly. "That's just the civil recovery," Evelyn continued.
"There will
probably be additional penalties and restitution as part of his criminal sentence. The federal prosecutor is talking about seeking the maximum sentence, 25 years. Arden arrived 20 minutes later with official paperwork from the federal court, followed by Gunther with celebratory donuts, followed by Gilmore with what he called the satisfaction of seeing mail fraud taken seriously by federal authorities. But the real celebration came that evening, when the 6 of us who'd become Gemma's unofficial legal team gathered on her back porch to watch the sunset and process what had been accomplished. "I keep thinking about something Lionel used to say," Gemma said, holding a glass of wine that Alicia had brought from what she called her special occasion stash. "He used to tell me I was too trusting, too naive about how the world really worked. That I needed to be more realistic about people's motivations." "Sounds like projection," Mrs. Patterson observed with the bluntness that had become her trademark. "Maybe, but for years I believed him. I thought my tendency to assume people were basically honest was a character flaw that needed to be corrected." Gemma gestured around at the group that had formed around her kitchen table and refused to let injustice slide. "Turns out it was actually my superpower." "How so?" I asked. "Because when I moved here and started trusting people again, trusting you to fix my gate properly, trusting Mrs. Patterson's strategic advice, trusting Evelyn when she said she wanted to help, trusting Arden's legal expertise, that trust got returned with interest. Gosh, all of you invested more in my case than you had any obligation to invest. That's what communities do," Alicia said simply. "We show up for each other." "But that's my point," Gemma continued. "Lionel was wrong about how the world works. He thought everyone was fundamentally selfish and dishonest because that's how he operated. But most people aren't like that. Most people, when you trust them to do the right thing, will exceed your expectations. As the evening wore on and the conversation drifted from legal victories to garden planning to Mrs. Patterson's surprisingly detailed knowledge of local wine production, I found myself thinking about transformation. Not just Gemma's transformation from isolated victim to empowered leader, but the transformation of all of us. 6 months ago, we'd been neighbors and acquaintances. People who waved when we passed on the street but didn't really know each other's stories. Now we were something else entirely. A chosen family bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. You know what the best part of all this is? Evelyn said as the group started to disperse around 9 o'clock. Lionel spent years counting on his victims being too isolated and ashamed to fight back effectively. He never counted on someone like Gemma landing in a place like Willowbrook and inspiring a whole community to take him down. After everyone left, Gemma and I sat together on her porch swing, surrounded by the garden that had flourished under her care and the gate that had brought us together in the first place. So what happens now? I asked. Now I figure out what to do with a life that's actually mine, she said. For the first time in decades, I get to make decisions based on what I want instead of what's expected of me or what someone else thinks I should want. Any ideas? A few, she said, leaning against my shoulder in the comfortable way that had become natural over the months we'd spent building this unlikely alliance. But I'm thinking I might start with something simple, like figuring out whether a certain handyman might want to make his visits to my house a little more permanent. I looked at her, surprised by the directness of the suggestion. Is that an offer? It's a question, she said, echoing our conversation from what felt like a lifetime ago. Would you consider it, even though I'm 53 and come with a certain amount of baggage and a tendency to attract federal investigations? I guess that depends, I said, pulling her closer. Do you still make iced tea that good? Better, she said, smiling. I've learned to make lemonade too. A week later. The legal dust had settled enough for us to start thinking about what came next. The federal case was moving forward with mathematical precision. Lionel's plea negotiations had collapsed when prosecutors discovered even more hidden assets, which meant he was looking at a trial that would probably end with the maximum sentence. Evelyn had been hired as a consultant by the FBI to help untangle similar fraud cases in other states. Mrs. Patterson had started a neighborhood watch program that operated with military efficiency and was already being copied by 3 adjacent counties, and Gemma had done something completely unexpected. I found out about it on a Saturday morning, when I arrived at her house to find her sitting on the front porch with architectural plans spread across the table, looking like someone who'd just made a decision that surprised even herself. Please tell me you're not planning to tear down the house, I said, studying what appeared to be detailed renovation drawings. Better, she said, and there was an excitement in her voice I hadn't heard before. I'm planning to expand it. Plans showed a comprehensive renovation that would add a workshop space, a proper home office, and what the architectural notes described as a community meeting room with its own entrance. Community meeting room? I asked. I've been thinking about everything that happened over the past few months, Gemma said, rolling up one section of the plans to show me the details. About how Mrs. Patterson had to coordinate our legal strategy from her kitchen table. How Arden needed a place to spread out documents that wasn't her tiny apartment. How Evelyn ended up working on federal cases from coffee shops because she didn't have proper office space. I was starting to understand where this was going. So you're building them a headquarters? I'm building us a headquarters, she corrected. A place where people who want to fight for justice, whether it's fraud cases or victim advocacy or whatever, comes next, have proper space to do that work. She pulled out another set of plans that showed the workshop space. And this part is for you, if you want it. A proper woodworking shop where you could build custom furniture again, maybe train other people who want to learn traditional crafts. I stared at the drawings, trying to process what she was proposing. Gemma, this is going to cost about $200,000, she said matter-of-factly, which leaves me with $200,000 for living expenses, emergency funds, and whatever else comes up. Plus, I'll still own the house free and clear. You've really thought this through. I've had time to think about a lot of things, she said, setting down the plans and looking at me directly. about what I want my life to look like now that it's actually mine to design, about what matters to me, what I'm good at, what kind of legacy I want to build. She stood and walked over to the garden gate that had started everything running. Her hand along the restored ironwork like she was checking the quality of the craftsmanship. For 26 years, I defined myself in relation to someone else's needs and expectations, she said. I was Lionel's wife, which meant I was supposed to be supportive and accommodating and grateful for whatever attention and resources he chose to share with me. And now? Now, I get to decide who I am based on my own values and priorities. She turned back to me with the kind of smile that suggested she'd figured something important out. And it turns out I'm someone who likes building things that last, who enjoys bringing people together around shared purposes, who wants to use whatever resources I have to make sure other people don't go through what I went through. I looked at the renovation plans again, seeing them differently now. Not just as a building project, but as a statement about what kind of person Gemma had decided to become. There's one more thing, she said, and suddenly she seemed less certain, more vulnerable. All of this assumes you'd want to be part of it. The workshop, the community space, the whole project of building something meaningful here. Are you asking me to move in with you? I'm asking if you want to build a life with me, she said, and the directness of it took my breath away. Not because either of us is lonely or looking for someone to fix our problems, but because we've spent the past few months discovering that we work well together, that we share values and priorities and a vision for what matters. Back over to where I was standing by the architectural plans. I'm 53 years old, she continued, and I finally figured out that the right person isn't someone who completes you or fixes what's broken about you. The right person is someone who sees what you're building and wants to help you build it better. I looked at her standing there in her garden, surrounded by plans for expanding her house and her life and her impact on the community, and I realized that somewhere over the past few months, I'd stopped thinking about what I was supposed to want and started paying attention to what I actually wanted. So, I said, stepping closer to her, are you asking me to marry you? For real this time? I'm asking if you want to spend the next however many years building something together that's bigger than either of us could create alone, she said. Whether we call it marriage or partnership or just really committed collaboration, doesn't matter as much as the commitment itself. I looked around at everything we'd already built together, the restored gate, the garden that was flourishing under her care, the community that had formed around her kitchen table, the sense of purpose that had grown out of fighting for justice together. Yes, I said simply, to all of it. The workshop, the community space, the life, the partnership, the marriage, if that's what you want to call it, all of it. Even though I'm 53 and come with federal investigators and a tendency to take on complicated projects, especially because of that, I said, pulling her into my arms. And I really like the person you become when you're working on them, sighed a daily tradition at this point. I scraped off the worst of it and called it breakfast. My phone was already buzzing with the usual suspects. 2 missed calls from my brother Gunther about some investment opportunity involving cryptocurrency and goats. I didn't ask for details. A voicemail from my landlord, Mrs. Miranda, reminding me that rent was due Friday, as if I could forget. And 3 texts from my neighbor Alicia Summers about her garbage disposal. She had apparently decided to stage a rebellion and was now making sounds she described as dying whale mixed with construction equipment. Then came the work call that changed everything. Is this Judd Patterson? The voice was warm but tired, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. I got your number from Henderson's Hardware. I need someone to look at a garden gate that's basically holding itself together through sheer willpower at this point. The woman introduced herself as Gemma Hotch, recently moved to Willowbrook from somewhere back east. She explained the situation, with the kind of detailed frustration that comes from staring at a problem for weeks without knowing how to fix it. The previous owners must have installed this gate during the Carter administration, she said with a slight laugh. It's wrought iron, probably beautiful once upon a time. But now it looks like it's planning its own funeral, honestly afraid to touch it in case the whole thing just gives up completely. I quoted her a reasonable price for an assessment. In possible repair, packed my truck with the usual collection of tools that had gotten me, threw everything from leaky faucets to collapsed deck railings, and grabbed a breakfast sandwich from Murphy's. deli that I'd probably regret by lunchtime. The drive to Willowbrook took about 25 minutes through our small corner of nowhere, past the elementary school where kids were already gathering, for the morning bell, past the post office where Mr. Gilmore was probably sorting mail with the same methodical precision he'd used for the past 30 years. Past the community center that hosted everything from bingo nights to heated town council meetings about parking regulations, Willowbrook was the newer part of town. Developed in the 80s, when everyone thought suburban sprawl was the answer to everything. The houses were bigger than what I was used to working on, with actual lawns instead of the postage stamp yards closer to downtown. When I pulled into the driveway of 847 Maple Ridge Drive, I could immediately see why Gemma had called. The house itself was impressive. A two-story colonial with good bones and mature landscaping that suggested someone had put real thought into the design? But the garden gate looked like it was being held upright purely by habit and stubbornness. The wrought iron was beautiful, with intricate scrollwork that spoke to quality craftsmanship. But one hinge had pulled completely away from the post, another was hanging by what appeared to be a single screw, and the latch mechanism looked like it hadn't functioned properly since the Reagan administration. That's when I saw her. Gemma Hotch was on her hands and knees in what had probably once been a flower bed, engaged in what looked like hand-to-hand combat with a collection of weeds that had clearly taken over during the transition between owners. She was wearing faded jeans with actual dirt stains, a flannel shirt that had seen better years, work gloves that suggested she wasn't afraid of getting her hands dirty. She was somewhere in her early 50s, with shoulder-length auburn hair, streaked with silver that she'd pulled back in a practical ponytail. When she looked up at the sound of my truck door closing, I was struck by her face, laugh lines around hazel eyes. It's the kind of expression that suggested she found life interesting even when it was trying to bury her in unwanted vegetation. "Must be Judd," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees with the practiced motion of someone who'd been doing this for hours. "Welcome to my ongoing battle with nature." "Nature's winning." I laughed despite myself. "Looks like you're holding your own." "I'm here about the gate situation." Her handshake was firm, confident, the grip of someone who'd learned not to apologize for taking up space. As she led me toward the problematic gate, I found myself noticing details. The way she moved with purpose despite the obvious fatigue. The small garden tools scattered around like she'd been working since dawn. The fact that everything about her setup suggested someone who was determined to make this place work, even if she was figuring it out as she went along. "I probably should have called someone weeks ago," she admitted, gesturing at the gate that was now leaning at an angle. That seemed to defy basic physics. I kept thinking I could figure it out myself. YouTube University, you know? I examined the gate more closely. The ironwork was actually in decent condition, good quality that had been built to last. But the mounting hardware had given up completely, and someone had attempted a repair at some point using what appeared to be duct tape and hope. "It's definitely salvageable," I told her, which seemed to come as a genuine relief. "The metalwork is solid. We're mainly looking at new hinges, proper mounting, and probably rebuilding the latch mechanism from scratch." "Thank God," Gemma said, and something in her voice suggested this gate meant more to her than just functional yard hardware. I know it's silly, but this gate was one of the things that made me fall in love with this house. His character. You know, history. I understood that feeling. In my line of work, you learn to recognize when something was worth saving versus when it was time to start over. This gate definitely fell into the worth-saving category. "How long have you been?" "In Willowbrook?" I asked, starting to unload my tools for a proper assessment. "About 3 months," she said, and there was something carefully neutral in her tone that suggested there was more to that story. "I'm still figuring out how everything works around here. The neighbors, the local customs, which grocery store actually has decent produce." As I set up my equipment, I found myself curious about Gemma Hotch and her story. 3 months wasn't long enough to settle in completely, but it was long enough to start establishing routines. Yet something about her demeanor suggested she was still very much in transition, still figuring out not just how Willowbrook worked, but how her life was going to work in Willowbrook. The gate assessment was going to take most of the morning. and something told me I was about to learn a lot more about both the gate and the woman who was so determined to save it. 1 year later, Gemma's house had become something none of us could have imagined. When this all started with a broken garden gate and a woman who believed in saving things that were worth saving, the renovation had taken 8 months. Partly because we'd done most of the work ourselves, and partly because Gemma insisted on historical accuracy for every detail. The workshop space had become my favorite room in any house I'd ever lived in. Proper lighting, quality tools, and enough space to take on the kind of custom furniture projects I'd dreamed about when I first started working with my hands. The community meeting room had already hosted 3 successful fraud case coordination meetings, a neighborhood emergency preparedness workshop that Mrs. Patterson had organized with military precision, and a monthly craft circle that had somehow evolved into an unofficial town council, where people brought their problems and figured out solutions together. But the real transformation was in Gemma herself. "You know what I realized yesterday?" she said, appearing in the workshop doorway with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of smile that suggested she'd figured something important out. "What's that?" I asked, looking up from the rocking chair I was building for Mrs. Patterson's new great-granddaughter. "It's been exactly 1 year since I asked you that question about marrying someone my age," she said, settling onto the workbench stool that had become her favorite spot for our morning conversations, and I finally understand why I asked it.
Ow.
"So, I thought I was asking whether I was still worth choosing after everything that had happened to me. Whether age had made me invisible or undesirable or somehow less than I used to be." She handed me the coffee and watched me work for a moment. But that wasn't really the question at all. I set down my chisel and gave her my full attention. "The real question was whether I was brave enough to believe I deserved to be chosen," she continued. "Whether I was ready to stop defining my worth by someone else's standards and start trusting my own judgment about what mattered." And it turns out the answer was yes. It just took me a while to get there. Through the workshop window, I could see the garden gate that had brought us together, now opening and closing smoothly as neighbors came and went from the morning craft circle. Evelyn was there, working on what she called therapeutic embroidery between federal consulting assignments. Arden was teaching someone's teenage daughter basic legal research skills. Mrs. Patterson was holding court at the center table with her latest project, a comprehensive disaster preparedness manual for small rural communities. "Speaking of getting there," Gemma said, producing a small velvet box from her pocket. "I have something for you." I stared at the box, surprised. "Gemma, before you say anything," she interrupted, "I need you to understand that this isn't about traditional gender roles or making grand romantic gestures. This is about wanting to make a public commitment to the partnership we've built and the life we're creating together." She opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with an inscription I couldn't quite read from where I was sitting. "What does it say?" I asked. "Building something that lasts," she said, taking the ring from the box, "'cause that's what we've been doing since the day you fixed my gate. Building something that's designed to endure, to weather whatever complications come our way, to be worth the investment of time and care and attention." I looked at her sitting there in my workshop, surrounded by the evidence of everything we'd created together, not just the physical spaces, but the community, the purpose, the sense of home that neither of us had been looking for, but both of us had found. "Gemma Hotch," I said, taking her hands in mine, "are you proposing to me?" "I'm proposing that we make this official," she said, and her voice was steady and sure. "That we stand up in front of this community that's become our family, and promise to keep building together whatever comes next. Even though you're 54 now, and I'm still figuring out what I want to be when I grow up, especially because of that," she said, echoing my words from a year ago, "I've learned that the best partnerships are between people who are still becoming who they're meant to be." I took the ring and slipped it onto my finger. It fit perfectly, like everything else about this unexpected life we'd stumbled into together. "Yes," I said simply. "To the marriage, to the partnership, to whatever complicated projects we haven't thought of yet." "Good," she said, kissing me, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you want and why you want it. because Mrs. Patterson has already started planning the reception. And you know how she gets about operational logistics. As we sat there in the workshop we'd built together, surrounded by the tools and projects that had become the foundation of our shared life, I found myself thinking about beginnings. How sometimes the best ones don't feel like beginnings at all. They feel like coming home to a place you didn't know you were looking for. 6 months later, we were married in the garden behind the house, with the restored gate standing open as a symbol of welcome for everyone who wanted to be part of what we were building. Mrs. Patterson officiated with military precision. Evelyn managed the logistics, and Arden handled the legal paperwork with the efficiency that had made her invaluable to our fraud-fighting operations. But the best part was the moment during the ceremony when Gemma looked at me and said, "Thank you for seeing what I was building and wanting to help me build it better." "Thank you," I replied, "for asking the right questions and being brave enough to hear the answers." Sometimes the most important things in life start with the simplest requests. Sometimes fixing a gate means finding something you didn't know you were looking for, and sometimes the most important question isn't about age or timing or what other people think. Sometimes it's just, are you brave enough to build something real? The answer, it turns out, is almost always yes. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.